Good evening, everybody. Venerable Children is down under in Australia, and so we'll be doing a little review of, tonight will be Chapter 6, Part 2, and in the next couple of weeks we'll do Chapter 8, which we haven't done before, of Aryadeva's 400. So let's start with our motivation. And in preparing for this chapter, I read something by Geshe Sonam Rinchen, which I thought was quite appropriate to think about. Thinking about how our afflictions are make our mind so unruly. They're so disturbing. And he makes an analogy to like a glass of water, and how, or a lake maybe, how when it's all disturbed like that, you can't see reflections clearly, and it's how our mind is when the afflictions are there. Our perception is really distorted, and we get ourselves in all kinds of trouble. And these afflictions that we have are three main types, the three poisons, which is what this chapter is about: clinging attachment, and anger, and confusion. So, unless we can free ourselves from these afflictions and their latencies, at any moment, even though we can seemingly be under control and everything's going okay, in any moment they can return. And so at any moment it's possible for our clarity to be stirred up like a glass of water. And so he's saying we have to like distill our minds, like you distill water, where you take out all the impurities. Because if you leave anything behind, as soon as it gets disturbed again, it makes the water cloudy. I really like that analogy, and let's think about using these teachings slowly to do just that, so that we are not in turmoil within ourselves, we're not creating turmoil for others, and we're actually able to understand others really well and have the kind of qualities that can benefit them, because we're all in the same situation essentially. These afflictions and then the actions we do from them keep us cycling again and again in samsara, and this is really unsatisfactory. So may we just take some time to delve into the teachings tonight and do this with the motivation to help others to be free of all their confusion, all their anger, and all their attachment. So this chapter 6 is, just to review, it's explaining how to abandon all these afflictions, and these are afflictions that don't allow us to do the bodhisattva deeds. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to focus mostly on a few verses that relate to confusion. And the reason I chose this is because the teachings were fantastic. They were very... I don't know how she said so much in such a short period of time. When I was going through it, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm getting nowhere here. It's only 10 minutes here, and it's taking me all these pages, and I'm like, oh. So anyway, they're, very helpful, and because the rest of this book is mostly about dependent arising, and the wisdom side of the path, reviewing the stuff related to confusion, I think is helpful. And I think the other stuff is a little easier to grok. So, in one of the verses it said, as wind is to all the elements, confusion's activity is to nurture. And so, just as wind increases the function of all the elements, we want to remember that confusion nurtures both our attachment and our anger. And so, we talked about attachment and anger last time I did this review. So, in terms of confusion, first we'll just have a little review, and then I'll try to not spend too much time on material I did before, or some of the material that we did before I'm going to go much more slowly. So we had two kinds of confusion or ignorance. One is the ignorance that's grasping at true existence. It's confused about the nature of reality. And the other is this ignorance of karma and its effects. So those are the two main categories that we're always describing. And both of those kinds of ignorance actually nurture the other afflictions of attachment and anger. And then with confusion, the antidote is to meditate on dependent arising. And if you look at your mind when you're confused, it's really easy to get kind of indifferent, to check out, to disregard things. You know, don't you see yourself doing that? I do. I see myself doing that, shutting down. And you know what? Those aren't antidotes. Those are not going to do it. We have to develop a wisdom that knows how things exist and that can differentiate the causes of happiness and the causes of suffering. So as much as we want to tune out by any way, shape, or form, you know, all the different kinds of laziness or whatever, it's not going to really help in the long run. So why do we need to eliminate these three poisons? Because they produce suffering. So that's all I'm going to say about that verse. And then another verse talks about how do anger and desire occur together the way confusion occurs with both of them. And I liked this analogy here. So the antidotes to anger and desire have to be applied separately because the antidotes aren't the same. Although, you know, so desire has the aspect of longing and anger has the aspect of aversion. So they're treated individually. And so this analogy is that it's like putting fire into a water pot. A fool thought he would mix fire and water and drop some fire into a water pot. Since they are incompatible, they can't coexist. So the point is that Joe Blow had asked a question about that, and that's a difference between confusion and the other two. Although confusion feeds the other two and nurtures the other two, though those two, anger and attachment, have different antidotes. And so how do we go about getting rid of these? We have to become, one of the verses, 134, says, thus constant awareness of their distinctions will bring an end to disturbing emotions. So we talked about this more last time, but just to remember that we have to develop this awareness of the different faults and the disadvantages of these things, recognizing them, seeing things as faulty, figuring out what their causes are, figuring out what the antidotes are, and by doing this process again and again, eventually all these afflictions can be cut out. And so that's really a lot of, we have to do it in the aspect of learning and listening, discussing and contemplating, and then meditating on these things. So, why is this faulty? What's the disadvantage? What does it make me do? What's causing it? What kind of situations do I get in when this is happening? How is this coming about? How can I eliminate it? What are the temporary antidotes? What are the long-term antidotes? I think that's a good question that she posed, because we're in the situation where we're talking about this confusion tonight. Well, we need things that are a little more temporary, because we're not going to be realizing emptiness tonight probably, and that's the main antidote. So we have to recognize that we have kind of short-term goals and long-term goals here, and that we work on all of them, but that's where we're at. So that's my little intro. We talked about a lot of these things last time. So now we're going to go on to verse 135, which is this famous verse, and verse 135 is about recognizing the root of the afflictions. And the question that's asked is, he says, Joe Blow says, the different characteristics, of desire and anger have been described, but what are the various characteristics of confusion? So then this is the verse. As the tactile sense pervades the body, confusion is present in all of them. By overcoming confusion, one will also overcome all the afflictions. And so, just the Geshe Sonam Rinchen says that the body, the tactile senses pervade all the other sense organs. And in this sense, they act as a basis where none of the other ones could exist without it, without this tactile sense. In the same way, confusion, which is this disturbing attitude of ignorance, it misconceives dependent arising, free from inherent existence. It sees things as truly existent. And so this is similar to the tactile that pervades all of the other sense organs, in that confusion pervades all the disturbing emotions, all the afflictions. So we misconceive things because of this. The distortion of confusion makes us think that things are inherently pleasant or unpleasant. It makes us think things are desirable or repugnant. And we think that it's just right there in the object, and we're just completely bought into all of this. So in order to get outside of this, we have to understand the mode of apprehension entailed, like how we're apprehending things, that we see things as truly existent. And how is that present in anger? And how is that present in attachment? So then there's a little more background on this, and then they get into this in some detail. So when we have desire, we're actually seeing the object as inherently pleasurable. It's inherently attractive. And with anger, we're doing the same thing, only we're seeing it as inherently unattractive and undesirable. So with both of these, we have confusion. And then this kind of ignorance, we want to recall how it fits into the big picture, and how understanding confusion and developing wisdom will get rid of our situation. So then Venerable talked about the 12 links. And the first link, which are, the 12 links of dependent arising, which describe our situation and samsara existence, both how we're in it and how we can get out. So the first link is this ignorance. And this ignorance then makes us do actions eventually, and that's the second link, and those leave karmic imprints, and then all the links follow from that. So if we can overcome this kind of ignorance or confusion, which by understanding dependent arising through meditation, then we can free ourselves from all of those following links and all of the afflictions that happen from that. And so this is why in this text from chapter 9 on, the effort that's being made is to help us to understand emptiness as the meaning of dependent arising. And that's what we're going to try to talk about tonight. But we're trying to place it in context first. I was really struck by one of the verses in the earlier chapter. I can't remember where it is, but to me it's like I just really was helpful to hear. I never kind of understood, why don't they talk about this, wisdom sooner, and why, where's the beginning of this path? And it took so long to try to understand that. And I think Aryadeva really, I had never heard this so clearly before. Without having the context of the Buddhist worldview, it wouldn't really help you to understand emptiness, because you wouldn't actually be able to understand it properly. Same thing with developing your concentration. Unless you place it in the right context, you can develop your concentration, but you're not going to use it in the right way. And with I think the philosophical studies, unless you have the right context for them, I think you're going to kind of get sidetracked one way or another, and you're going to it's not going to work. So that's why I think in this part they take the time to, before getting into the emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising, they're trying to place this in the context of, hey, we have these afflictions, we're trying to get out of cyclic existence, and this is the way. So it's kind of putting it in a bigger context. And then recall that ignorance isn't an absence of knowledge that we're talking about here. It's just not knowing something. That's not what it's about. It's more like an active thing where we're misapprehending things very actively. We're actively thinking things exist opposite how they do. So this ignorance is ignorance with respect to the fundamental nature of reality. One kind of ignorance. The other one is about karma and its effects, and we're just kind of out to lunch in terms of what brings happiness and what brings suffering and how we should be moving in the world because of that. So basically what that boils down to is something that we have, even as practitioners, we still don't have in our own, as a realization that our experience is due to our past actions, and the causes of happiness is virtue. And we still, every day we're like, why is this happening to me? Like, come on. But, slowly. We think about it, eventually. So anyway, that part about karma is the conventional nature, how things function. Okay, so now it kind of gets into it a little bit more. So there's a lot of discussion about this particular verse. There's one kind of way it's described where they say you're grasping at inherent existence, and that leads you to grasp at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, and then that leads you to have this gross attachment and gross anger. So that's one way. It's kind of like A leads to B leads to C. But these three mental factors, the ignorance, the grasping at the self-sufficient, substantially existent person, the SSSE, and the affliction, they have three different modes of apprehension. And so that's where I think there's probably so much discussion about this, and I don't think it gets completely cleared up in this talk. So we'll just review again. So this is one way. Ignorance apprehends things as truly existent. And then based on that, you have another kind of ignorance that apprehends a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. And then based on that, you generate these gross afflictions. And this is where, so I can't clarify this completely, although this comes up again and later in the talks, and I think it will come up again in the teachings further. But one thing Venerable said here is that the issue what's at issue here is kind of has to do with the timing. She said, when I push the geshes on this, they say something that they don't want to say on record because it's kind of against the party line. But privately they'll say that this is happening in three different moments. The ignorance grasping at true existence leads to the ignorance grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, and this leads to the arisal of desire. And that these three mental factors apprehend their object in a different way. Because of that, they don't occur simultaneously. And so that's kind of, that's something just kind of to think about. We're not going to understand, I think, that all those ramifications of that fully, but I think this is going to come back up. In fact, she did explain it again, and I have it in my notes here. I'll tell you where it is if you want to listen to something about this, but it's on the next page. So, yeah, it's on, this whole topic comes up again on March 6th, which is the 44th teaching at about the 26th or 27th minute of the video. So we might hear about that again even soon. Okay, that's one way of explaining how this all works. But another way is a way that His Holiness explains. And this is where he kind of does it in the context of the Prasangika school of understanding things and the lower schools. And so when the lower schools talk about the mental factor that keeps you bound in cyclic existence, they talk about it as grasping at the self-sufficient, substantially existent person. And the Prasangika say, no, it's grasping at an inherently existent or a truly existent person. And this is, the big difference between the Prasangikas and all these other schools, because they actually accept inherent existence. It's not a problem. So that even the Svatantrika Madhyamika and when they talk about the selflessness of persons, that's the chief thing that keeps us bound in samsara. It's also very different from how the Prasangika talk about this. So we're talking now about the first link, the ignorance that keeps you bound in samsara. So they have different ideas about that. His Holiness says that this indicates that there are gross and subtle afflictions, and this is how he kind of explains this, another way to explain this verse. So what he's saying is that the afflictions arise due to grasping at the self-sufficient, substantially existent person are gross, compared to the afflictions that arise due to grasping at an inherently existent person. So I think I can explain this clearly to how Venerable Children said it, but it still is not completely clear. And so go to that teaching I mentioned, because she talks about it again, and I think it revisits it with more depth. So that's on 3/6/2014. So anyway, we'll keep going, and we'll get as far as we can get tonight with what she said in this first, time through. So, okay, so the afflictions that arise from grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, everyone recognizes these as afflictions. But the afflictions that are more subtle, the ones that arise from grasping at a truly existent person, not everyone recognizes those as afflictions, because they don't see grasping at inherent existence as an affliction. They have different ideas about this. And so then we had some really good questions, and I skipped all these last time, but I want to spend time with all this. So then the question was asked, well, what do they recognize them as? And she said, well, they don't really recognize or talk about this in terms of being the first link, of the dependent arising 12 links. They don't see it that way. So in the Svatantrika Vanyamaka, they might talk about it in terms of the selflessness of phenomena, but they won't talk about it in terms of it being the root of samsara. And then I think this is more her own thought. She says, when you think of it, it's got to be like when you have gross desire, the subtle desire has to be there at the same time, underneath that somehow. And I think she says the subtle one, when there's the grasping at true existence, it's together with the desire. And this is where it's like the verse, the tactile sense pervading the other senses. And because that desire is grasping at the attractiveness or the pleasantness of the object as being inherently existent. So it's very subtle. And that's different from grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person and then having desire. Because the gross desire isn't grasping at the object as being inherently pleasurable or inherently unpleasant for anger, for example. So that's kind of a difference there. You following?
Again,
sure.
Desire is not grasping.
So the grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person and then having desire, the gross desire that we're having isn't grasping at the object as being inherently pleasurable or unpleasant, is what she said. So let me keep going, and maybe it will come out, because I think it gets clearer what she's saying here, but it's still kind of challenging. So she says, when you look at it and you try to identify these things in your mind, it gets very difficult, because we can't tell the difference between what's normal and what's grasping in a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, let alone what is grasping at inherent existence. We just don't see that. So there's a lot of, let's keep going. I think she gets back to this, because it wasn't real clear, and so somebody asked her to clarify it. So that she says that, there's a lot of discussion about this and how this ties into the selflessness of the person and the different schools. And then a question comes up, but isn't this first link, I think this is yours, the view of the transitory collection, the jigta? And she said that yes, for this view of the transitory collection, the jigta, for the prasangika, is a kind of ignorance. And so for the prasangika, this jigta is a subtle ignorance that grasps at true existence. And so that's the kind of one that's grasping at the true existence of your own self. That's what that means. It arises depending on grasping at the true existence of your aggregates. And so these things are related. And so it doesn't mean that when you're grasping at the true existence of phenomena, that isn't the first link. It's really, I've learned about that last summer. It's both, there's not two, what it is the objects are different, but the type of grasping is the same, is what it comes down to. The grasping at phenomena is truly existent, the grasping at your own person is truly existent, that mode of apprehension, that grasping is the same. It's just the object is different. And both of them are rightfully called the root of samsara, but it doesn't mean that there's two roots of samsara, there's just one. And that was a big point in these teachings.
And it's a sequential.
It is sequential, that you first grasp at the self of phenomena, and that leads you to grasp at the self of a person. But when you get yourself out of this, you do it in the reverse order. Yeah. Okay, so now she comes back to this thing about, that's not so completely clear in this teaching, but next time maybe someone will get to this. So anyway, but this is what she said this night. So then somebody asked, to clarify, is His Holiness saying that grasping at true existence arises together with the gross desire? And she says no. He's saying that the subtle desire itself also grasps at true existence. So when it's a subtle desire, the two are kind of combined, but when it's a gross desire, they're kind of not. That's what I got from this. But she goes on, and the question goes on and says, well, is that different from the distinction of the three modes of apprehension? And she said, yes, because the one who says they're different, say, first you grasp at something as inherently existent, you grasp yourself as inherently existent, then you grasp yourself as a substantially self-sufficient, substantially existent person, and then you generate desire. So those two ideas are different. So then it goes on and explains this a little more. So His Holiness, she goes on and says, what His Holiness is saying is that desire, that incorporated in the desire is also grasping at true existence. And there I think she's talking about the subtle desire. The other way doesn't say that the desire is grasping at true existence or grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. It's just another step. So they really are, that first one, the first way that we present it is really grasping at true existence of something and then going on from there. Okay. But in this subtle desire, the desire itself contains an element of self-grasping. And then somebody in the audience says, self-grasping ignorance? And then she comes back and says, no. She didn't say no. She just, they say it contains an element of self-grasping. That's what she said. So that's interesting. So we're just going to learn what we can tonight, and then as we get through the other chapters, maybe we'll learn more. So then a really good question came of, well, what are the implications of this debate? Which is a really good question, because, well, unless you identify what is to be negated, I mean, the grasping of true existence in your mind and counteract it, unless you do that, you're not going to get yourself out of cyclic existence. You know, so, so figuring out these differences is quite important. And so that's where the Prasangika are always saying, if you don't realize this emptiness, you can't realize, you can realize what you say the self of persons is, but you won't get out of samsara by realizing that. It's kind of basically, all the lower schools think that the root of cyclic existence is something other than what it is. So you can realize those things, but it's not going to free you. Because you've got to realize, according to the Prasangika, what's going to get you out of cyclic existence, which is seeing the lack of inherent existence. And that's why when we study the tenets, all this stuff comes up about the object of negation, and, you know, because that's kind of what you're negating. So then the next verse is 136. It has to do with recognizing the antidote that eliminates confusion. And the question is, well, what are the means to get rid of this confusion, which is the root of futility? And we went over that last time. Why does they say root of futility? Because, hey, you're going to be in cyclic existence unless you figure this out. So the verse says, when dependent arising is seen, confusion will not occur. Thus every effort has been made here to explain precisely this subject. So when we understand dependent arising in all of its forms and levels, then confusion won't occur because our ignorance will be abolished. And then this is where we get into the topic of dependent arising. And dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness, and emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. And now she's going to explain this. So if you think about it, if a sprout existed from its own side, it wouldn't depend on a seed, right? Mm-hmm. It would have its own nature. It wouldn't depend on anything else to arise. Similarly, our actions, our karma, if they existed from their own side, then they wouldn't depend on ignorance. They'd just have their own nature and they wouldn't depend on causes. So that kind of doesn't work. So in the 12 links, what we recall is that our karma, our karmic formations, our karma depends on the first link, ignorance. If all these links existed on their own, on their own independently, then they wouldn't depend on any causes. They'd just be sitting there independent of other things, just like a sprout would be independent from the seed then. So we have to, through many kinds of reasoning, understand that a sprout and so forth is exclusively a dependent arising. It's not existing by way of its own entity or from its own side. And in the same way, we have to understand this causal dependence, seeing that everything that functions or changes depends on causes. So, in order to understand the subtle levels of dependent arising, which are besides the causal dependence, there's dependence on parts, there's mutual dependence, there's dependent on imputation. We have to have a little more reasoning and explanation to understand those, really. So when we begin, it's not so hard for us to understand the causal dependence. We can see that things don't really exist independently on their own. But what does that really mean? What would it look like, existence from its own side? It would mean something was objective, out there, not depending on any other factors, any other causes, parts, attributes, anything. It just is. And also would be independent, totally independent of the mind. So you could say, like, about this clock, or about this voice recorder, any of these things, that it exists even without anyone ever having labeled it. Just is. No one ever conceived of it. Just is. And that's how things actually appear to us. That's what's crazy about all this, is that's how they appear, but it's not possible. So could these things, like this clock, could it exist if no one had ever really conceived of it? If you'd never given it the label clock, would it be a clock? How could it be? It's just not possible. So things have to have the label, and they have to have the concept. If no one ever had the idea, like, how would this ever work if nobody had come up with the idea of a voice recorder? So everything exists depending on having a basis, what's the parts, what's there, and the mind that conceives and labels it. And labeling can be very subtle. It's not just naming. It's our what we do in our mind with labeling is more subtle than that. Like, for instance, babies, I'm sure, label things, but they don't even have language yet. So it's deeper than that. Okay, so then we apply that to a clock, but how about this feeling that we have of I? that I'm just here, me, independent. We have that feeling when we say I. There's this independent thing here. And we don't think that it has anything to do with conceiving and labeling. It just doesn't feel like that at all. I'm here, I'm talking, here's the paper, I'm talking, I'm holding the paper. You know. So what's crazy about this, when you think about it, is that this way that we go about this kind of like the appearance of things and how we don't see things is so messed up that we do this same process with about everything, like friend, enemy, and stranger. We're completely designating those things, or like saying somebody's beautiful or somebody's like repulsive to you or any of that. So we're kind of, the appearance is so strong that we're kind of clueless about this without thinking about it. So remember the part of the verse where it says, when dependent arising is seen, confusion will not occur. So if we understand dependent arising with a valid direct cognizer, then ignorance can't arise. All confusion will have ended, the karmic formations will end, and all other afflictions and all suffering will end. So all of our karma and our suffering will end when this confusion ends. And how do we do that? This is based on understanding dependent arising. Dependent arising is the exact opposite mode of existence from how we are apprehending things with ignorance. So ignorance sees things as truly existent. It apprehends or grasps things to exist from their own side. Objective existence, and dependent arising is the total opposite. So we can say these words, but the realization of this is a completely different ballgame. And so this is what, our task is. And then to realize how difficult that could be, you have to understand that the lowest Buddhist schools actually believe that things are dependent arisings and they exist from their own side. Mm-hmm. The lower two schools, actually. Maybe, I'm not sure about at least the lower two. Not the Yamakas don't believe that, but so, people who are pretty sharp, they have a way to understand this that makes that work. So it's not so easy to have the full understanding of dependent arising.
Is the realization of dependent arising with a valid direct cognizer? Mm-hmm. Does what then is appearing to your mind exactly the same as emptiness? Is that where we're going with this?
No. Well, say that again. Ask your question again.
So, if we realize dependent arising with a valid direct cognizer, somehow the direct...
Why did she say that in here?
Yeah.
Okay.
And how is that realizing dependent arising with a valid direct cognizer different from realizing emptiness with a valid direct cognizer? Or do we then see the same thing when you're coming at it from those two angles? You get what I mean?
No. Say it again.
Okay. So somehow in my own mind, so we talk a lot about realizing emptiness with valid direct cognizer.
Right.
First we have it through the appearance of a meaning generality, and we penetrate that with our wisdom until we have this direct realization. Right? From the emptiness side. Is the realization of dependent arising with a valid direct cognizer the same, do we see, is what we're realizing the very same things as when we realize emptiness?
I would say no. But it hasn't been addressed.
So she didn't come to that?
No, it doesn't come to that.
Yeah.
But I'll go through what she does go, because she explains it completely, but it doesn't go that way.
Okay.
And, yeah, what it goes to is that your understanding of dependent arising isn't complete.
Until you realize emptiness.
Well,
okay.
it comes up. And we're going to complete all these pages, so we'll just keep going until we finish. Okay, so, What ceases confusion is seeing dependent arising, right? Because dependent arising is the exact opposite mode of existence from how ignorance is apprehending things, right? We got that. So let's go on to where, what do the Prasangikas say about this? When you really investigate with reasonings thoroughly, you'll see that inherent existence and dependent arising are totally incompatible, and that's not what the other schools see. Prasangika understand that if something is inherently existent, it cannot arise dependently. And if something is dependently arisen, it can't exist from its own side inherently. So this is where we start learning about the emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. And what she did is she said, well, this is what the last 8 chapters are about, but then she just went into it. And what she did is she used Lama Tsongkhapa's Ocean of Reasoning, and that's a commentary on Nagarjuna's treatise on the Middle Way. And I'll send you all these notes, which I've already actually sent you, but these are more colorful because they have it in blue, so I can find it easier. So, because I think that his writing is just so clear as always. So what Lama Tsongkhapa says is, emptiness comes to mean dependent arising for Banyamikas who have refuted inherent existence through a reliable cognizer, not for others. Okay, let's repeat that, because this is important. And we went over this last time, but we're going to do it again. Emptiness comes to mean dependent arising for Banyamikas who have refuted inherent existence, but not through a reliable cognizer, but not for others. So what this means is that emptiness comes to mean dependent arising for Banyamikas, these people who hold the highest view. They've refuted inherent existence through a reliable cognizer, so they have at least an inferential realization of emptiness. So for them, emptiness can come to mean dependent arising, but it won't happen for somebody who doesn't have at least that realization of emptiness, that inferential realization. So then she goes on. This is Lama Tsongkhapa again. When such, and I don't know if she put that in or if that, she didn't say it the first time, but every other time she said it. So it's referring to the Madhyamikas who have at least an inferential understanding of emptiness. When such Madhyamikas explicitly ascertain that external and internal things arise dependently, reliant on causes, then they ascertain the meaning of the emptiness of inherent existence through the force of that very awareness. So Madhyamikas are those who have at least a valid inferential realization of emptiness. External and internal things refer to external objects and internal states of mind. When all of these things arise dependent on causes, when you've realized that, then you can ascertain that the meaning of emptiness of inherent existence through the force of that very awareness. And that kind of answers your question. If I go back to your question, I would say that they actually have such a deep level of realization of causal dependence and emptiness of inherent existence that when causal dependence is in front of them, because they've realized emptiness at some level interferentially or directly, then through that very awareness, boom, it's there. So they've already realized emptiness. Otherwise, just knowing that things are dependently arising doesn't mean you'll automatically know that they're empty. Okay, so then it goes on. She says this, repeats that when Madhyamikas explicitly ascertain that external and internal things arise dependently on causes, they ascertain the meaning of the emptiness of inherent existence. Okay, so again, kind of repeating here, it has to be those people who have that level of realization, because you can understand dependent arising and not have realized emptiness. And that's what's kind of happening with the lower schools. They see that things are dependent arising. They have some level of understanding of dependent arising, but they don't realize emptiness. So, for example, even a farmer knows that crops depend on seeds, but a farmer hasn't realized emptiness. And even ascertaining dependent arising doesn't mean that you have the realization of emptiness. And that's why it says such Madhyamikas. They have actually the ones that the meaning of for those who for emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising, they actually already have the realization of emptiness. It's those Madhyamikas. So then, this was the question we always had when we were studying this before. So what does it take to have that inferential realization then? Like, how do you get there? It's like, how does that work? And then she said you need the syllogism, and we talked about that last time. So I'm not going to spend so much time on that because I want to get through all these other pages. But we did go through that last time. And it basically comes down to this. There's two parts of the syllogism that you have to understand. So for instance, the sprout is empty of true existence because it's a dependent arising. So if you just know that the sprout is a dependent arising, it doesn't mean you know it's empty. Because you have to actually apply the subject, the reason has to apply to the subject. So basically, we may know that the sprout is a dependent arising, but you also have to know the pervasion. If it's a dependent arising, it must be empty of true existence. And so you have to have those two things on board to make this, to get to the inferential realization of emptiness. Does that make sense? Kind of quick, but we did this one before, so. Okay, so it's not just like, oh yeah, it's empty, or oh yeah, it's a dependent arising. It's like, this is a realization that has a very strong impact on the mind. Okay, then we'll go on. And then Lama Tsongkhapa continues and he says, through explicitly ascertaining that phenomena arise dependently, those who have the correct view of reality, and this means those who have realized emptiness with this inferential, reliable cognizer. So then Venerable repeats, through explicitly ascertaining that phenomena arise dependently, those who have the correct view of reality will immediately and explicitly ascertain their emptiness of true existence. Let's say that again. Through explicitly ascertaining that phenomena arise dependently, those who have the correct view of reality will immediately and explicitly ascertain their emptiness of true existence. So here you've got somebody who has the correct view. They look at this cup, or they're looking at a person, and they're thinking, whoa, that person is totally dependent on their parts, and maybe being labeled by the mind. There's no person there from their own side, because everything that exists is something that's a dependent arising. This is my question to her there, is that why she used those example of parts and labeling. But I haven't asked her that yet. Because then it really goes on. So a person who's thinking like that, immediately and explicitly they'll know that the person is empty of true existence. And then Lama Tsongkhapa goes back and it says, he goes on and says, by understanding that true existence implies independent existence, they know validly that independent existence and dependent arising are contradictory. So it's kind of like what we were saying before. True existence implies independent existence, right? And we know that that can't happen. Independent existence and dependent arising are contradictory. So this actually still is back to the causal, in my mind, the causal kind of dependent arising. And so what Venerable says about this is that, okay, the person knows that true existence and inherent existence, that these things mean that something is independent, that it doesn't exist due to causes and conditions or parts or in relations to anything else. It doesn't even exist independent on a mind that's labeling it. So none of that's really happening. So they know that true existence is implying independent existence. And they know that independent existence and dependent existence are totally contradictory. It's not just words. They're really grokking it. Dependent existence and independent existence. Something is one or the other. It can't be both, and there's nothing that is neither. That's how you get to that point. You have to think those things through and then realize, wow. So here's what Lama Tsongkhapa says. So if they see that something's a dependent arising, then Lama Tsongkhapa says they immediately and explicitly ascertain that thing's emptiness. Are you following it? Because it just can't, there's no other way it can be, because those things just don't hang together. So that's seeing that emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. And then she goes on and explains the three types of dependent arising, and she has to do this, I think, for us to more fully understand the reverse, which is where we're going next, is that dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness. So she explains the three types of dependent arising. And these, well, actually they're taught in different ways. One way is from Jangya. There's causal dependence, there's dependence on parts, and dependent designation. That's what we're kind of used to, those three. Causal dependence applies only to things that are products, composite phenomena. Dependent on parts and dependent on name and imputation or designation, they pertain to both products, things that are cause, and also unproduced phenomena like space, emptiness, true cessation. So we find it easier to understand causal dependence. It's just like you go to work, you get a paycheck, right? And that's easier to understand than dependence on parts. And when you understand those two, it actually makes it easier to understand the more subtle one of the three, which is dependence on name and concept, or dependence on imputation. They're the same thing. So that means that there are these levels of subtlety of dependent arising. So, we understand the first one. If you want to play a musical instrument well, you got to practice. You want to grow carrots, you plant seeds. We have that. And then we get the one about parts pretty well too, because we have a lot of science background, and we think there's all these, parts that make up atoms and molecules. We just don't think things are so solid as we know our body is a bunch of cells, so we can kind of get the parts thing. But the one about dependent on concept and label or term, this one is not one that we actually have such an easy time with. We get it on a basic level. We would know that until somebody was hired and designated as the principal of a school, they wouldn't be called a principal of a school. And we know that until we take our ordination, we're not called Tupten whatever. So we get at that. But it's not, that's not the deep level of this understanding. Okay, but to try to get there, we want to do these, we want to realize that this is kind of a sequence. Causal dependence helps us understand dependence on parts. Those two help us understand the dependence on term and concept. But another way this is explained is in two: causal dependence and dependent designation. And then dependent designation is split into two, and this is where we get the mutual dependence and the mere dependent designation, or dependence on term and concept. And the mutual dependence is this thing how long depends on short, self depend and other depend on each other. You can't have this side of the valley without that side of the valley. Things are mutual like that. Okay, so let's go to this one that's the most difficult, which is depending on term and concept. So for any thing to have an identity, it really can't stand alone. It has to depend on other things. Other things have to exist. And that they always use this thing of like agent, object, and action, right? So it's like there's a drink, there's a drinker, and there's the action of drinking. None of those things can exist without each other. They can't happen alone. There's no drinker without a drink. There's no drinker without drinking. You can't have something in the cup. There's just nothing like that is standing on its own. So the mind has to take all these different things and put them together, and on that basis we conceptualize things and we give it a label, and it's not just like so gross as the label on a can. That's, I think, what Jeffrey said when we were talking that one time. That really stuck with me. Labeling isn't just what I see on that bag over there. Sundown, wait, whatever it says, sleep, can't wait, whatever. Okay, so now this brings us to the topic of dependent arising as the meaning of emptiness. So to fully, this is the important word here, to fully understand dependence on designation, this is Lama Tsongkhapa speaking. To fully understand dependence on designation by conceptuality, one must understand emptiness.
Dependence on.
So to fully understand dependence on designation, this is how it's written, we don't actually say it. Dependence on designation by conceptuality is how we wrote it. One must understand emptiness. So now we use our words. So causal dependence, dependence on parts, these can be a reason to prove emptiness. Understanding dependence on term and concept is a reason to understand emptiness. But you don't fully understand this last one, this dependence on designation by conceptuality, until after you've realized emptiness. So we can use all these different levels of understanding that we have of dependent arising, these three kinds, or the four, however you break it up. They can help us to realize emptiness, but you really don't fully understand this dependent on term and concept one until after you've realized emptiness. So what this means is that when you have an understanding of emptiness, even an inferential one, and you're focused on emptiness, when you come out of those meditations, you still have to establish how things exist. This is an important point in our school. If you can't establish how things exist, then your realization of emptiness is not complete. It's not accurate, and you're actually falling to a nihilistic extreme. After you realize emptiness, when you come out, you have to establish how things exist on a conventional level, and that's through this dependent designation. And you really don't understand that completely until you've had some kind of realization of emptiness. So Lama, I think we've kind of said that enough times that we get the point. So now we go on with what Lama Tsongkhapa says. He says, through the force of explicitly understanding emptiness, the subtlest level of dependent arising is ascertained without the need for further reasons. And let's read that again, because he's always so succinct. Through the force of explicitly understanding emptiness, the subtlest level of dependent arising is ascertained without the need for further reasons. So that means that just the force of explicitly understanding emptiness, either direct or inferential, this subtlest level of dependent arising on term and concept will be ascertained without any further reasoning. And this is the meaning, this is what it's meant by the meaning of dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness. So that means that someone who explicitly realizes dependent arising, they immediately and explicitly ascertain emptiness, and they don't need anything more. They immediately go to that because they've realized emptiness before. And also, then somebody who understands emptiness, they will easily ascertain the subtlest level of dependent arising without the need for further reasonings. So that means that when you come to this point, dependent arising and emptiness, they come to the same point. And this is where, in our three principal aspects of the path, this is what Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about when he says, the analysis of the profound is complete. Dependent arising serves as both the reason to prove emptiness and the meaning of emptiness. So it's kind of like we progress along to get to that place. So the dependent arising is both the reason to prove emptiness and the meaning of emptiness. Dependent arising is the reason for emptiness because we say the sprout is empty of inherent existence because of being a dependent arising. So in that sense, dependent arising is the reason that establishes emptiness. But it's also the meaning. When you explicitly understand emptiness, then the subtlest level of dependent arising is ascertained without any need for further reasons. So that means that the meaning is there. Almost done. I think I left out that whole last stuff. Good. We'll end close. Okay, so then she kind of backtracks and reviews. So when somebody knows that a sprout is a dependent arising, that's in the syllogism, is the reason applies to the subject. The sprout is a dependent arising. That's what's happening there. The reason is applying to the subject. You don't necessarily know that it's its emptiness of inherent existence or of true existence. And if you did, just by knowing that, then it wouldn't be a reason for establishing emptiness of true existence. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, if you merely understood the dependent arising of a sprout from applying the reason to the subject, if you merely understood that the sprout is a dependent arising, then dependent arising, one doesn't really understand that it's empty of true existence, right? So then this dependent arising couldn't be a reason to establish the emptiness of true existence. It's basically saying the farmer knows a seed is going to make a sprout, but he doesn't, if he only knew that, there's no way that reason of dependent arising is going to help him understand emptiness. It's that you need both parts of the syllogism. So that's the part where the reason applies to the subject. The reason is dependent arising, right? And the subject is the sprout. And then the thing we're trying to prove is empty of inherent existence. Okay, so you have to have both parts of the syllogism for it to work. And actually she makes that simple for us, but I think they make it a little more complex when you read it. They go back and forth a few times, you know. But I think actually if you knew that much, you might be able to figure it out. Let's see. And then Geshe Sonam Rinpoche says, when one discovers that existence by way of a thing's own entity is invalidated in many ways, one discovers how phenomena exist. So he's kind of saying there, when you understand that things existing by their own nature, when you negate that in many ways, which is pretty much what Nagarjuna does left, right, and center, with all these different reasonings, then you're going to actually understand how phenomena exist. And what you're going to understand is that they're empty because they're dependent arising. They exist because they're dependent arising. And this would really help us a lot. You know? I mean, this would help us in our day-to-day life. Okay, we'll finish with this a little bit because it's short. So this view that we've just been talking about is unique to the Prasangika. And it's different from the lower schools, as we said. For them, things exist dependently and they also exist objectively. So the lower schools say that if things merely existed in dependence on term and concept, then anything could be anything and nothing would exist at all. That's their concern. For them, for something to exist dependently, it has to have some kind of essence. If it doesn't, then it's not existent at all. And so they think that the Prasangikas are nihilistic. And the way that the lower schools prove that they're not nihilistic is they assert that if something is a dependent arising, it also exists from its own side. In their view, that's how they avoid being nihilist. But the Prasangika say, no, it's a dependent arising and it's empty of existing from its own side. So what they're saying is that when you search with ultimate analysis, trying to find out exactly what the object is, you don't find anything that exists from its own side. Doesn't mean there's nothing there. And so basically the big point of all this, if we go back to the beginning, is to free ourselves from this chapter is how are we going to abandon these afflictions. And so we have to understand the different kinds of ignorance that are in our mind, especially these two types, fully. One is more the conventional way things are happening, and the other is more the ultimate. And so by doing that, even though we won't, even though we don't have realization of these things, we actually still can use these things to work on our afflictions. Of course, we need to use more short-term means to work on our afflictions because we need, a little more help than these theoretical things. But these things don't stay just at the level of theory. I mean, I think Venerable has just given us so many tools in terms of, like who's angry? Where's the anger? She just brings this stuff in. And so that's our task, is to, listen, to discuss, and then, as we can enact these things, make examples with all of it, so that we can be nicer, kinder people. That would be a nice start. See the kindness of others, and then help beings. So, all your questions next week. We're over time.